almost all my time in that building. I'm also a new mom to my 2-month-old son who was very sick this weekend. So if I'm a little befuddled, please ask questions. I hope this will be informal and just informative and interesting for you all. So the title is Art as Research, Research as Art, Why I Founded the Lobby Gallery at the Lew Institute for Global Issues. I'm going to give you a bit of my background and what led me to found it, and then a bit about some of the exhibitions we've had. And then I thought we'd leave some time to discuss what that means and if you all are all interested in research and art and how those things kind of connect. And Ryan's here. So, that will be at the end. I want to thank you guys for inviting me here. Thank the Musqueam people on whose unceded ancestral lands this presentation is being given. All of the Lew Institute staff and faculty who have let me do crazy things in the building and continue to let me do crazy things in the building. And my husband for taking care of our son while I tried to prepare this talk. So this was the lobby of the Lew Institute for Global Issues. And I really want to explore why I wanted to do something and transform something like this into something like that. And so the talk will kind of go through that in different phases. I'm a bit of an activist, and I'll get to that later in the presentation, and a lot has to do with how I see public space and the uses of public space for creating dialogue. The second part is the lobby gallery, which was created at the Lew Institute, was kind of a bit of a thoroughfare for many different types of researchers and different peoples, because they rent this large room called the multipurpose room next door. And I thought it was a good opportunity to bring different issues into conversation with the different people that pass through. So I thought it was just a good opportunity to create this kind of space there. I studied communication studies for my bachelor's at Concordia in the 90s. And I think one of the things that had really stuck with me was this theorist named Jim Carrey, and it's my one hokey joke. This isn't actually him. I just figured you'd remember his name. His name's James Carrey, and he writes about communication as culture, and he talks about how our society usually sees communication as kind of the transmission model. Like you say one thing, it gets to somewhere else. People analyze it in terms of the media that's said, whereas he kind of looks at it in terms of a ritual view. And he says that communication is really about a process whereby reality is created, shared, modified, and preserved. And I was really kind of conscious about this as I graduated from my bachelor's. I was making experimental documentary films at the time, which don't ask very small audience for such things. But it made me think a lot about what I was creating and what kind of hegemonies I was either going against or supporting, and how people viewed what I was presenting to them, any type of communication. After my bachelor's, I started becoming a photographer. I became a photographer, and I did a photo essay about the old city of Jerusalem. At that point, I lived in Montreal. That's where I was born and raised, and there was a lot of tension between the Arabic and Jewish communities there. And I decided to go to the old city of Jerusalem and to really try to speak to the people there to get an idea of how they view living in the middle of this very heated area, which is reported on and represented all over the world in a myriad of ways. And I met this young boy who was Arab and lived in the Arab quarter and worked in the shop. And he was very kind of relaxed about it. And he said, oh, there's been war here for centuries. This is no different. Or there was this promo photo shoot at the Western Wall where they were taking photos of soldiers praying there. And it was about the PR that has to be going on for the soldiers a little bit in terms of the perspectives that is seen around the world. And just one last example is this man who had a shop in the Christian quarter, and the lack of tourists from the war was just killing him and his family. And so I tried to present these different perspectives and the different hardships for the different communities that lived in the old city. And I had a show, and it was very interesting because all the different communities came to the show, the Arabic community and the Jewish community, and they liked it. But when they asked me to re-show it, and it happened on both sides, like the Arabic, this one man wanted to show it in a coffee shop, but he only wanted to show the photos of the Arabic community. He wanted me to leave out all the ones of the Jewish community. And I was like, that kind of defeats the purpose of this photo essay and of trying to create dialogue. And the similar thing happened with the Jewish community. And so I was kind of frustrated at what avenue the galleries or this form of exhibition was able to provide in terms of dialogue. My life really changed about 2004. I was invited to northern Uganda by a woman actually who lives in Vancouver. She's part of Mindset Media, and it was to create a film about the war in northern Uganda. And I was brought on as a photographer and a production manager as well. And on that film, we had a researcher whose name is Erin Baines, who I think might be here today. She's hiding, but she's there. And it was the first opportunity that I got to really think about the role of the researcher in terms of creating communications, to have somebody who has been in a place for a more long-term. I think she had already been there for about 3 or 4 years. She had community connections, which we were interested in using, and she just had a very different perspective than any film crew that would come in, and a much more critical perspective as well. So that got me thinking about the role of researcher and art and communications together a lot more. I won't tell you too much about these projects, but one of the things that Erin was strongly working on at the time was how communities were dealing, how communities were dealing with the return of children who had been abducted and using their own type of cleansing rituals to welcome them back into the community. And so these different perspectives that someone who just came or was even staying for a few months would probably not have access to. When we came back from shooting that film, the woman who was funding the film and Erin Baines and the Lou Institute, they were also involved, sorry, put together a campaign, and it's a terrible name, but it was a really interesting idea. It was called Act for Stolen Children, and the film played a role in it. And basically, they joined researchers who were working on northern Uganda, artists, advocacy groups, and politicians all together to try to push forward some type of attention to the situation there. And I thought that was also a very interesting, you could call interdisciplinary approach to communications and social change, social justice. Around that time, I decided to go back to do my master's degree, and I ended up at Ryerson University in Toronto in a Master's of Fine Arts program in documentary media, actually. And I was really interested in these questions of research, communications, and social change. And I was trying to ask how, is social change documentary possible in a more depoliticized age? That was kind of the subject of my master's. And to do so, I decided that I really needed to spend more time to present different types of stories. And I was still interested in the war in northern Uganda because I had been back 2 or 3 times already, and I felt like they were my community and I didn't want to leave them. So at that point, I decided to go back and stay in an internally displaced persons camp and just stay with one girl for over 2.5 or 3 years. Not the whole time. I would come back to classes and then go back on the breaks. And it's Beatrice. She's sitting there, and the title of the project was Her Name is Beatrice. And it really, for me, tried to show what daily life was like in the middle of, again, the middle of this kind of chaotic representation that's shown around the world about war. It's her and her brother waiting in line, and her husband at the end. She had a baby by the time I was there. In any case, at that point, I was really interested in trying to also team up the communications with researchers and show them at different conferences that were taking place. But I was also really became interested in the idea of public space and presenting the communications of the work in places where people normally wouldn't expect to see them. And so I did do the gallery show, which had the photos, and there's an installation in the center. But I also tried to push for more public space. And so this is outside of the gallery in the hallway of a building, and there was the noise of her knocking in one of the installations to try to grab people out of their daily routine and to try to think about some of the social justice issues that were going on in the world outside of the television or outside of the gallery or outside of the newspaper where people would normally think about it. I also did it, this is in Toronto, in the window of a bookstore on, I can't remember the name of the street now, on Dundas Street, sorry. And it was the same installation with her knocking. And again, it would draw people out, and it had all the information. And free booklets were inside with the story. And finally, in terms of what I experimented with at the time, I was able to get these screens donated, and they had links to the website and the story. And so I was trying to experiment a bit with public space and bringing these different types of stories, social justice issues, to people in different ways. So I went for my master's, and I became a student in the anthropology department here and doing my PhD. Part of it was after I had been with Beatrice over those 3 years, I was really interested in looking at perspectives of war or post-war on the ground from the people who lived through it. There are all these different theories about transitional justice and how people move on after conflict, but I felt the anthropological kind of view really interested me because I thought it had more of a chance of understanding how people actually live through it. Not how they're told to, not how the programs tell them to or how they should, but how people are actually just trying to deal with it. And that's why I went into anthropology, and thank goodness they accepted me. And then the Liu Institute that year accepted me as a Liu Scholar, which also, thank you very much. And it was at that point that they let me turn this into a space like that. And the first show I did was the show about Beatrice that I had done my master's work on, and this is the opening of that show. And at the time, I knew I wanted to do a show there, and then I was like, well, there must be other people like me, either researchers who are interested in, exploring a different form of communication, especially if it's a social justice issue, or artists who are interested in speaking with researchers. And so the idea of the gallery was born, and it was an empty space that wasn't being used. It's a very kind of easy thing that it was called the Lobby Gallery, but it could also stand for lobbying about a certain political issue, so that was just a happy coincidence. And we said we would try it. The Liu Institute kind of put funding up to some of the infrastructure for it, and people started asking for shows that first year. And in the 4 years, we've had 25 shows, 10 from PhD students, 2 from faculty, 3 from related UBC organizations, 8 from outside artists, and 2 from community organizations. And that was another part that I was trying to get more interaction with, was the outside community, outside of UBC as well, like community groups that were also interested in the same social justice issues as some of the researchers and artists that were presenting. And so one of the models that I used for my show and that kind of continued over the years was we joined with a network that was at the Liu Institute, the Transitional Justice Network. And for the opening, instead of just the art opening itself with the wine and the food, which we still do, of course, we had a panel discussion bringing in different interdisciplinary people to speak about some of the issues, or one of the issues that the art touches on. And so for the first one, it was about arts and mass violence. And so we had Judith Marcuse, who's a dancer, Pilar Riaño Alcala, who's a School of Social Work, and then we had an English department PhD student who had done her PhD on the 9/11 memorial. And so that's kind of how it's set up with the first show, and then it continued afterwards. And I'm not going to go through all the shows, but I'll just give you an idea. This was from another, at the time she wasn't a PhD student, she's an artist, Julie Batek. She's a writer actually and a poet. And she was interested in doing something but couldn't quite figure out how poetry could go in a gallery. But I was really interested in bringing work like that to the gallery. I thought it would be different. And so what we did in the end was printed the poems on this kind of sticky, clear material and pasted it all over the windows. And again, for her opening, we had different people speak to what she was speaking about. The show itself was, she was writing poetry. She's also working in northern Uganda with Erin Baines. And she was writing to the women who had survived capture by the Lord's Resistance Army rebel group and had returned, and were telling their stories. So just to give you an idea, I don't know if you could see it. You could see it more on the bottom, but how the poetry fit into the gallery. Second show I'm going to talk a bit about was an invited artist from the University of Alberta. He was on the faculty art history, I believe, and he was kind of embedded in the Canadian military base in Gaza. And it's not embedded, it's like they host an artist to do different things. And he's very skeptical and critical. And again, for his talk, we did the same idea of inviting interdisciplinary people to speak. But what he did is he covered the entire wall with one image, and the same on the other side. And it actually caused the Liu Institute a little bit of problems with building services, but it's actually one of my favorite shows. That was the other wall. And the shots from at night from outside are pretty cool as well. He was really concerned with the way that war was represented as well. And he really wanted to show the mundane aspect of what was going on at the base, to kind of question how war is represented and whether it's spectacle or spectacular in which ways. And so I'm not going to speak to him, it's his work, but that was one of the shows I really liked that was presented there. Here's one from faculty at UBC. It was actually a collaboration between two faculty, Xu Xiong in visual arts and Jennifer Jun in sociology. And they do their research. They did some of their research together, and it was about the dams in the hydroelectric dams up the Yangtze River in China. And they also, which was really interesting, aside from having the artist talk and the opening and the installation work, they also had 2 documentaries shown as part of the events. And I thought that was also a really interesting way to branch out. And so I don't know if any of you have seen his show. He's shown it in quite a few places around town. But there was the installation of the boats, and then there was the photography, large photos on the wall. Something completely different we tried last year was one of the community organizations I was talking about. And it was called Writing in Community. It was November 7th, 2012 to January 10th, 2013, so about a year ago. And it was with Thursday's Writing Collective. It's a program for writers on the downtown east side. And these are the people who are part of this collective. And the woman, I guess third from the right in the black shirt, Ellie, is the organizer, and she does these writing prompts. And she was interested in doing something with us, but she wasn't sure how the writing event could be a show. And so I said, well, I think the idea of an event would be really interesting. She describes it as a 2-hour live social writing encounter themed on the issues of social justice and accessibility. And it was actually a really, really interesting event. And what we did afterwards was take some of the writings that people did, and she prompts people with photos as well and drawings. And everyone in the room writes down and then shares what they've written if they want to. And it was really interesting to have the different crowds of people from the downtown east side who were able to come up in a bus, and the different communities at UBC. And I think it was probably one of our more successful encounters in terms of that. So that's part of the writing encounter that night. There's another one from a student. This is an anthropology student, actually. And I'll tell the story because she was very hesitant. She says she's not an artist. She never did anything artsy. And she was in my cohort when I started. And she told me she works in Alaska, and she works with the Mexican community there. And she said she had found these amazing postcards and placemats in one of these restaurants that kind of superimposed the different monuments from Mexico into the Alaskan mountains. And she thought that was really interesting for her work, but she's not a communication analyst in that way, but she thought it was really interesting. So I thought it was fascinating that these existed, and I thought it would make a really interesting show and give her an opportunity to explore it. And so she decided to listen to me, and I was very happy about it. And she had images of the photos and then showed the actual postcards as well, and also did a talk about migration, the Alaska, US, Mexico kind of link. Tonight there's an opening, actually, which I'll shamelessly plug. Afua, who's actually a visiting fellow at the Liu Institute. It's their first visiting fellow artist, so it would be great if people came out and supported that initiative. And she'll be showing these beautiful kind of collage paintings she had done. And there'll be a conversation, of course, beforehand on diaspora and community. And I believe that starts at 4 o'clock. Yeah, 4 o'clock to 6:45 p.m. As I was thinking about this talk, I was thinking a lot about art and research and art, and what the difference is to me, or if there was a difference, or what I saw is quite similar. And for me, it's a very similar process of discovery and of seeking something in different ways, and each project is different. When I did my PhD work, my field work last year, I wasn't sure I was going to take any photos or have any installation or anything of that sort. My focus was really on getting to know what the community was doing. I was living with a family there. And in the end, my mother and father there asked me to take a portrait of them for their 25th wedding anniversary. And they didn't want me to take photos the way I usually do. They didn't want me to cut people off or put it on an angle or have them doing something. They wanted to be framed very properly and in their proper clothes and in front of something specific or something nice. And I went home, I came back for a conference, and I made them the print and brought it back. And then everyone else in the community, it's a very rural community, wanted the photo too, because photos are quite rare. And so in the end, I will be working with these portraits to create a show and installation about how we perceive survivors of war. but I will be using their images. And again, it wasn't something that I had set out to do specifically, but it came about as part of my research as I was there. And these two definitions, I went to the etymological dictionary, and I'm kind of curious to ask you a bit about it, is where research come from, which is the old French rechercher, is to seek out, to search closely. And then the idea of what an artist is, and nowadays it's more known for the fine arts, one who cultivates the fine arts, but back in the day, if you look here, it was the arts presided over by the muses, which is history, poetry, comedy, tragedy, music, dancing, astronomy. And it was also used for anyone skilled in an art or craft, including professors, surgeons, craftsmen, and cooks. And I thought that was kind of interesting to think about how that has changed today, whereas before it was actually quite close in terms of what we did. And I don't know if any of you have any comments or questions, or if any of you are practicing artists or researchers or interested in one or the other, but I'd be very happy to hear from you if anyone has anything to say. You can take your time. Has anyone been to a show at the gallery? At the Lobby Gallery? All the Lou Institute people? Well, it's a good opportunity to come tonight. And there was one hosted by someone in your faculty actually last year. It was the G-Bikes, which was a community organization who came. I can show you some of their images. They had set up this installation, and the rotating bicycle powered the television, and this was set up in the gallery. I'll show you just some photos of different work. But if you want to ask a question, please do. This was an artist from Vancouver, and he was working in the downtown east side, and he staged this large-scale photo of the different communities who had been displaced over the years from the downtown east side. His name is Greg Masuda. This was another professor at UBC who worked with a photographer in the Mexico-Canadian, U.S. borderland, and they had done a photo essay. This was an artist from Toronto working on bees and our perceptions and biases and prejudices and what bees were doing. And she linked in, I believe with a professor from here as well, to look at bees and the importance of bees to the ecosystem. This is from a photographer who ended up being my husband. He was working on Tibet, and this was an image from the train that connected Tibet to China. It's a photo by a local artist, David Gitterham, who was doing painting actually, and it was also about questioning war and representations of war. And the aerial view that's presented today and how that kind of disconnects us a lot from what is being represented. And again, I can't speak for the artists themselves, but just to give you an idea. This was a PhD student who timed it, I think, with the sociology conference. And so she had her show up, and it was a show that she did in conjunction with her thesis. And she timed it with a conference that was going on in the city. And this was the last one we had, which was an artist. My name is Scott, and it was video art, the first time we tried it at the Lou Institute. And it was about do-it-yourself. It was about guerrilla gardening and living on the land. Yes? My own? I lived in community, and I worked with one of the research methods, other than ethnography and living in community, was working with a youth group on a cultural program that they were doing. And so I funded this program that they had wanted to do about cultural revival, is the way they put it. And so I was working with them. Can you hear me? Sorry. I was working with a youth group in northern Uganda, and it was someone who I had known over the years. And so when I got my scholarship, I said, what would you like to do? Like, how can I help you achieve one of your dreams since you helped me achieve one of mine? And he said, well, I'm part of this youth group that had started when they were in the camps. And he said they would like to do further programming. It is one of the few jobs available in rural areas, is to have kind of a community-based organization. And so I funded this project, and they wanted to do a project on cultural revival when they were living in the camps, their group did cultural dances with the children. And so they wanted to kind of continue that and go to the villages themselves. And so they did the programming, and I was just watching or working with a lot of it. So it's community-based. I don't think it's well, I don't know what you would call it exactly. It might be somewhat par, but I worked in that way with them, basically. Oh, cool. To do it. Well, part of their programming was to try to rejuvenate that. So my thesis actually looks a lot about intergenerational knowledge and how it was transformed from the war and displacement into the camps, and how it's coming back now that people have returned to their land because they were displaced for over a decade. And so what the group was partially trying to do was to bring the elders and the youth back together. Because a lot what happened over the years where the NGOs value knowledge very differently. Knowledge comes from outside, it's not found within the community, and when you grow up like that, I think anyways there's always the generational differences, but even more so I think epistemologically speaking, where knowledge comes from was really shifted during the time in the camps. And so they were trying a bit to get beyond that and get the youth and elders working together on cultural revival, the way they put it. But that's really, I'd love to know what your friend, have some information about it afterwards. Yeah. Yeah, so I've been photographing for a very long time with this specific community, and while they were in the camps and then after they've gone home. And so I would always ask people's permission to take their photos and try to explain where it will be shown afterwards. After I had some, I was able to show them the installations or the big screens or things like that. It was a lot easier to show after the first time. But at the beginning, especially in 2004 or 5, when the war was quite at its really, really bad period, people really wanted to tell their story. And they were very much aware. I remember people would say, oh, in Palestine, when one person is killed, it's all over the news, but thousands are dying here every week and no one knows, so please tell it. So I walked into a situation where it was very much people wanted to hear about it. And then ethically, in terms of danger, I would change people's names back then if there was anything, but I tried not to sort of exploit the tragic story specifically and try to tell more, stories of survival that were happening. And so over the years, people know me and they know I'm a photographer, and I've come back with photos over the years. Since 2004, so it's quite a bit of time. And so I'm always concerned about that, but I would always ask for people's permissions. If there's a long line and you don't see what someone looks like at the back, then I wouldn't ask 100 people in line, but certainly. And especially because when I started going to Beatrice, it was mostly about her and her family and the people around her. And then this time as well, I was living there for 7 months, so there was just ample time, to speak to people about the project and what was happening. Is that kind of, okay. Yeah. I think it's really interesting. And like I said, it happened to me in a way that I hadn't planned this last time with these portraits. And in the end, I learned quite a bit from the portraits and how people presented themselves and what they wanted me to take their picture with and where and who they wanted me to take their picture with. And so in a way, it became a bit of a research tool, but I hadn't planned on it. However, working with the youth group, I knew they were going to do dramas and that type of art, I guess you could say. They were going to do drama and song and traditional practices like storytelling, which I consider an art. So I was very interested in using those, and I kind of shy away from introducing media or art that isn't already being used in the community in some way in terms of working with people, like as a tool, I guess. Even though, for sure, photography is definitely outside, but they knew me already at that point. I think there's really interesting potential, and it depends on each community, which tool or which art I would think of using. You know what I mean? Like, I know some people, when I first was working there, were like, oh, did you give the children cameras to document their own? And I'm like, well, in a way that would be unfair to do that and then leave without any batteries or access to power, or I didn't want to create that kind of relationship. I'd rather use tools and arts they have within their communities. So I think every community is different, but that's how I feel about it. Yeah? Absolutely. Absolutely. I think, let's say photographers, for one thing, and artists, they're more skewered. They're held a lot more critically, I would say, than researchers. Ethically speaking, I think they're always attacked first when they're portraying or when they're doing something that's touchy, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but there are a lot of researchers that do very highly suspect ethical things, which no one doesn't end up in the front news about, you know, the photographer who took the picture of the vulture. I don't know if you remember Kevin Carter. He was skewered for that. You know, and how many researchers have I seen over the years who go into community and are like all about data, gathering data, and not really caring. So I do think when you're doing something in the public, you have to just be ready to deal with more public scrutiny, first of all. Secondly, I remember a professor I knew who, you know, used to go to art exhibits and say, oh, they're just lazy. Like, why don't they just tell me what they want to say? And then I had artist friends who were like, oh, but professors, they just write in journals for their elite bunch, you know, the 15 people. And so I think there's a bit of that, you know, crossover that doesn't always happen and that could happen. And you could tell different layers of a story in different ways. I also knew someone in my department who was interested in art, and she was like, but she was really concerned ethically, and how do I take this very layered and complex thing and just put it in an image with a short text, you know? And she couldn't quite wrap her head around how that could also be complex and how that could evoke questions as well. I don't know if I answered your question. But no, go for it. Not with funding. I've been lucky with funding. Once, okay, I have two examples, one from Canada and then one from Uganda. So the one in Canada, remember I showed you that photo of the window in that, in Toronto? Hold on, I'll just get to it quick. So I had this display at the bookstore, and it was Beatrice knocking on the window, just asking, hello, are you there? And there was a story about like how youth are represented. All the papers around her were all the documents about protection of children and protection of internally displaced people, and I kind of wanted to contrast what we think we know about it or what people are saying should be done with someone's actual story of what they went through. And inside I put the booklets for people to take, like color the full story so it wouldn't just be sort of, that's it. And the guy at the bookstore said, you should charge 25 cents. And I'm like, I'll just give them away. He's like, we'll charge 25 cents and then people will only really take them if they want it. So I was like, okay. So I go after, and there's still like 20 left or so. And I had left about, I don't know, a few hundred, but there was at least 20, maybe 50. Like an amount I was really shocked at because it was up for a long time. And I asked the girl there, like, how come, you know, you could have just given these well. She was like, well, some people really wanted to know where the quarter was going. And I was like, it cost me like $4 a book to do. Like, so there's that suspicion right away, right? And I'm not saying it's wrong or, you know, I'm critical also, but there is that suspicion, I think, of, oh, where is my money going to? And is it just going to the artist to support their extravagant lifestyle, you know? Whereas really, you never make money off of this kind of thing. And I did kind of, when I did get a really good scholarship, I felt like I had to give back to the community in some way, which is why I then partnered with that youth group. Because there was that feeling of, you know, I was working with the community over the years to get something I really wanted and dreamed of in the end, and so I wanted them to have that as well. And then the Ugandan example, which does happen, is, I think it was in 2010 when I was there, and some people get drunk. It happens everywhere. And I was taking photos. I think it was the health, so the Ugandan Ministry of Health was going to the camps. They were still just leaving the camps at that time. And they were showing videos about, it was a hepatitis E outbreak. And so they were going around showing these big videos, and I was trying to get a photo of, the scene of the information videos, and everyone gathered around to watch it, because it was something to watch. And this guy, he was wearing a Toronto Maple Leaf shirt, I'll never forget. I'm a Montreal fan, so it was pretty serious, but it was random. And he was kind of drunk, and he was like, oh, you're taking pictures, you're just going to make money off of us. So there is also that perception among some people if they speak it. And then people kind of were like, that's not what she's doing, we've known her. I mean, but obviously it's there also. And I think on both sides, you kind of have to acknowledge that it exists and be honest about it and try to navigate it. Is that all? All right, well, I'll let you guys go. Thank you very much. If you have any other questions, come to me.
Can I ask you, sorry, can I ask one?
Yeah, I was just going to close that. Can you listen to that? Do you mind?
Did that girl, the Beatrice knocking, with that